Thank you, Mark. And luckily we are late, which means that we have talkative humans. If we had AI organizing the conference, we would be on time. And now you have a talkative Italian, so great risk. So it's a pleasure to be here today and to address the 2024 Corporate Governance Conference. And thank SIAS and in particular David Gerald for inviting me and for organizing this event. I guess it's my 6th or 7th time I'm here, 3 times. This is the 3rd in person and 3 by remote, after COVID. Now the conference is timely because we explore the intersection, the broader title of artificial intelligence and sustainability, 2 areas that are really reshaping corporate governance. And now the presentation after the previous one will focus as asked, on climate and supply chain governance. Now companies play a critical role in mitigating the impacts of climate change, and honestly I was very impressed by in particular by the previous presentation, the second one, Dr. Hanna, was very, very important. And ongoing developments in regulatory and disclosure requirements are driving the future of corporate governance, and so promoting more sustainable practices. Now, as these evolve, obviously companies must work to keep pace. Now, in this context, I will focus on 3 main areas, namely, growing expectations towards businesses, a state of play in terms of policy developments, trend, and data, and how we can support more ambitious business action in this context. Now, climate change and then supply chain governance have rapidly risen to the forefront of global business priorities. Since the Paris Agreement, expectations for credible private sector actions on climate change have evolved significantly. Companies, are expected to progressively reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and adverse impacts on carbon sinks in line with the internationally agreed global temperature goals. To support these efforts, policymakers have increasingly been setting expectations for companies and investors, which is a necessary but not sufficient condition. For example, now, since 2010, the number of ESG and climate-related regulations has tripled in the US, Canada, and Australia, quadrupled in UK and China, and increased 5-fold in Japan. These now reflects a growing international consensus. In 2023, we updated the OECD guidelines for MNEs on responsible business conduct. And this has become the first internationally agreed standard to recommend actually that business align their greenhouse gas emissions with the internationally agreed temperature goals. Now, disclosure and reporting obligations remain, I would say, the most widespread option in terms, or at least initially, in terms of policy approaches to improve climate and supply chain governance, putting pressure then on to act. Now, climate-related disclosure requirements cover jurisdictions accounting for half of global GDP and almost half of global emissions, in countries that are home to nearly half of the 2,000 largest listed companies in the world. A lot of attention has been on the EU reporting rules under the CSRD, the Corporate Responsibility Directive, as well as the SEC regulation. Now, Asia is moving in this regard, fueled by increasing demand for ESG and climate-focused transparency. Now, we as elaborate in our report, OECD report, Sustainability Policies and Practices for Corporate Governance in Asia, which we issued in 2023. Countries such as India, Japan, Singapore, introduced policies supporting in different ways mandatory disclosure, sustainability disclosures, sometimes or often on a comply or explain basis. In past 6 months, also China has introduced regulatory measures and policy updates related to corporate sustainability. I guess you are aware that China, major stock exchanges in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing released the final text of the sustainability disclosure rules. And these rules introduce a mandatory reporting requirements for major Chinese companies, including also the biggest investors, almost all listed state-owned banks, top finance and insurance providers, and dominant players in coal and steel, rare earths, and lithium. Now, the measures reflect a double materiality approach for how corporate environmental and social risks, opportunities, and impacts should be considered and reported on. Quite interesting. OECD standards represent a unique, internationally agreed reference point for these developments, and OECD remains at the forefront of supporting efforts to enhance climate and supply chain governance, particularly through its standards and ongoing work on responsible business conduct and corporate governance. Importantly, our standards recommend that responsible business conduct due diligence measures should be tailored to incentivize continuous engagement rather than disengagement from supply chains. Now, in addition, according to the OECD G20 Principle of Corporate Governance, which, by the way, is also an FSB key standard for the only OECD FSB key standard, Singapore is full members of the Corporate Governance Committee, the company should report on their material sustainability issues if it can reasonably be expected to influence an investor's assessment of a company's value, investment, or voting decision. So something I would say intermediate in the debate of materiality and double materiality, but the new Article 6 of the principles is quite, I think, quite advanced. Now, I'm trying to recover some time, Mark. In terms of the key trends, now our OECD Global Corporate Sustainability Report, which we issued this year, shows that climate change is considered to be a financially material risk for listed companies that account for 64% of global market cap. Now, given the importance of this risk, almost 3,000 companies representing over half of global market cap have established a board-level oversight of climate-related issues, which was also mentioned, as one of the important issues this morning. One of the areas that is particularly challenging is the disclosure of Scope 3 emissions. So namely GHG emissions from a company's supply chain and the use of its products. Now, only 35% of companies covered by the Climate Action 100+ initiative are currently disclosing Scope 3 emissions. And similar figures are found when looking at disclosure practices across sectors and geographies among the biggest 44,000 listed companies globally. This is more or less the number of companies around the world, where actually Scope 3 disclosure rarely goes beyond 30%. Now, Scope 3 emissions are important because for most companies, and certainly for all investors, this is where the bulk of emissions are. For most companies, it's not possible to be climate neutral without also decarbonizing their supply chain and so addressing the carbon footprint of their products and services. So this goes also much beyond the listed company per se. We were discussing this morning with the minister about that. Now, the OECD M&E guidelines recommend that business align their greenhouse gas emissions and impacts on carbon sinks with internationally agreed temperature goals of the Paris Agreement based on the best available science. The M&E guidance also recommend that businesses map their GHG emissions in the supply chain and cooperate actively with their suppliers and business partners to reduce emissions, including in relation to Scope 3 emissions. So active role of companies in the supply chain. But it's not straightforward. Recent developments have underlined that some corporates who made so-called net zero pledges in the aftermath of the Paris Agreement in 2015 have faced difficulties adding actions to words. There is an implementation gap between corporate level GHG emission reduction pledges and their implementation and execution. Recent analysis of the world's largest 2,000 publicly listed companies by revenue suggests that less than half have established net zero targets. Meanwhile, less than 5% of companies globally have a detailed transition plan, while 30% have an incomplete plan and the majority have no plan to meet the net zero target. In addition, only about 17% of climate action 150 focused companies had set medium-term targets in the second round of net zero company benchmark assessment, even though such targets are necessary to gain a better understanding, also from an investor point of view, to gain a better understanding of a company's proposed transition trajectory. Also, majority of these focus companies, 2/3, 65%, have not established Scope 3 targets. And bottlenecks also emerge when it comes to reaching a small and medium-sized enterprise, okay, all SMEs. Because SMEs globally account for 40% of business sector greenhouse gas emissions. So we cannot do without them also tackling the issue, okay, then in a proportionate way with phasing in. But this is very, very important. So it's not just a question of, of the largest, listed companies market cap. And for instance, with 2022, actually, Roger, the survey in the UK of SMEs found that more than 3/4 of respondents did not have carbon targets in place, and half did not know the meaning of the term net zero. So really, we need a lot also of, I would say, we always talk about investor education. We need a corporate education, future issuers education, really on that, even on the basics. Now, how can we, support some more ambitious business action? We need to take action, at least, okay, just to summarize, at least on 3 fronts. Now, first, we have this morning, in many cases, discussed already the role of data. And I mean, economists, we need, evidence-based analysis. So we need better and more consistent data, and not, pears and apples. Now, we also are actively working towards improving data quality, usefulness, and transparency of methodologies related to climate and sustainability data. We will soon publish a study to better understand the patterns and characteristics of ESG metrics underpinning key sustainability issues. We have reviewed over 2,000 individual metrics from prominent ESG rating providers and assessed the degree of comparability and availability of the metrics and the extent to which they align with international sustainability standards. We can do much more. Second, we need better policy cooperation. We have seen major trends in the adoption of regulations and policies on climate and sustainability. And this acceleration of initiatives has, in some cases, created duplication and divergences across countries, which can be costly for business and ultimately consumers. To respond to this issue, the OECD is setting up an inclusive platform for due diligence policy cooperation. The platform will foster cooperation between governments around due diligence policy, including how to design accompanying measures, address implementation challenges, and avoid unintended consequences. The first meetings will take place next year and will be open to all interested governments, whether OECD or non-OECD. So this is also an invitation for you, and will be informed by expert business and stakeholder input. And third, before also they put the chair on and they push me out of the stage. Businesses need better support, in particular SMEs. So they account for, I told you, 2/3 also of employment, so very important, and more than half of GDP. And in fact, 99% of businesses are SMEs, in particular in many, many countries. There can be no net zero without SMEs. New regulation in Europe and elsewhere will require companies to conduct due diligence and social issues and to report on their progress. So SMEs will not be directly in scope, but as business partners to a larger company, so in the supply chain, the standards and expectations in these laws will be passed on to SMEs through the value chain as well. We recently published analysis of greening practices across SMEs that can provide governments with a better understanding of the variation in SMEs' environmental engagement and the options to improve uptake. And so last, as a final point, earlier this month, actually, we launched the Responsible Business Conduct for Green, Digital and Resilient Supply Chains in Asia project. Through this project, the OECD is collaborating with businesses and policymakers in 5 high-income countries in Asia-Pacific, including Singapore. I have my colleague or my director came in here. And to take action across all 3 of these fronts. So improving the data, fostering policy cooperation across the region, and boosting industry capacity on supply chain due diligence. So, just to conclude, climate and supply chain, governance are important, for corporate sustainability and resilience of companies and societies. By prioritizing robust governance and due diligence frameworks, we protect investors and stakeholder interests by addressing sustainability impacts, risks and opportunities. So SIAS on this will play a key role, crucial role in promoting these practices and fostering dialogue. And so I'm confident that we can count on your also ongoing support to uphold our standards in enhancing resilient and sustainable economies globally. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the forthcoming discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmine Di Noia.